Mr. Speaker, my speech on microbeads, small pieces of plastic found in consumer products like facial cleaners, shower gel, and toothpaste, begins in the year 1997, 18 years ago, Mr. Speaker, in the waters off the northeast coast of Newfoundland. And an incident that came to my mind the instant I heard of this Opposition Day motion outlining how microbeads, small pieces of plastic, could have serious health impacts, and calling on this government to add microbeads to the list of toxic substances managed by the federal government under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. Now, Mr. Speaker, getting to my story. The year 1997 was the 500th anniversary of John Cabot's discovery of Newfoundland, and a great year in the history of the world it was, Mr. Speaker. Newfoundland and Labrador being the God's country that it is, Mr. Speaker. In 1997, to mark the 500th anniversary of John Cabot's historic voyage from Bristol, England to Bonavista, Newfoundland, a recreation of Cabot's ship, the Matthew, was built and sailed from Bristol to Bonavista. I was in Bristol back then, Mr. Speaker, a young journalist covering the launch of the Matthew for the Telegram, the daily newspaper in St. John's, Newfoundland. Hundreds of thousands of people watched the Matthew sail down the River Avon. What a sight it was, Mr. Speaker. Thousands more people, Mr. Speaker, were in Bonavista, Newfoundland, weeks later, including the Queen of England herself, when the Matthew sailed into Bonavista. And a grey, foggy day it was, Mr. Speaker, just like the great Newfoundland song, Grey Foggy Day. Once the Matthew arrived in Newfoundland, Mr. Speaker, over a period of several more weeks, she proceeded to circumnavigate the island of Newfoundland. Now, every day, Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, from secretaries to plumbers, from lawyers, businessmen, reporters to politicians, Mr. Speaker, we all took overnight trips on the Matthew from one leg, one community to the next. I sailed on the Matthew, Mr. Speaker, on the first overnight leg from Bonavista to nearby Greats Cove, and that memory, Mr. Speaker, it will always be with me. The Matthew, she was a wooden caravel, 78 feet long, 50 tons, and she bobbed in the North Atlantic, Mr. Speaker, like a cork in a bottle. It was nasty weather, Mr. Speaker. Old-timers call that kind of weather Capelin squall, a mixture of bone-chilling winds, rain, and fog that typically hammers the Newfoundland coast in late June, just as the Capelin are coming inshore to spawn. Now, I took my turn at the wheel, Mr. Speaker, and I was on the deck of the Matthew the next morning when the sun finally rose and started to burn the fog to shreds, Mr. Speaker. And what is the very first thing I saw in the waters off Greats Cove, Mr. Speaker? What's the very first thing I saw in the waters off Greats Cove aboard the Matthew, the recreation of John Cabot's ship? The first thing I saw, Mr. Speaker, in the water was a plastic shopping bag. First thing I saw, Mr. Speaker, never forget it. Plastic shopping bag floating in the ocean. Now, I can tell you with certainty, Mr. Speaker, that John Cabot, he did not see a plastic shopping bag floating in the ocean. He was too busy, Mr. Speaker, as legend has it, dropping buckets over the side of the Matthew, buckets now, pulling in cod, Mr. Speaker. Oh, and on a side note, Mr. Speaker, there's a news story out today about how it may be another 10 years before the moratorium on northern cod, that's the same cod that John Cabot caught in buckets, another 10 years before that moratorium is lifted. Now, by then, the ban of commercial fishing on northern cod, which was first brought down in 1992, Mr. Speaker, it will have lasted 33 years, Mr. Speaker. As a Newfoundland and Labrador MP, I make it a point at every opportunity to hammer that home to this government and the third party in this House, Mr. Speaker, that it will have been 33 years since the greatest industry in Newfoundland and Labrador failed under complete mismanagement, as a result of complete mismanagement. And my apologies yesterday in this House, Mr. Speaker, during question period when I lost it in my seat after a Conservative MP, the MP for Pitt Meadows Maple Ridge Mission, he said his government's management decisions are, quote, always based on science. My apologies, Mr. Speaker, for reacting to such ridiculous statements. I should be used to such ridiculous statements. It's the fire in my belly, Mr. Speaker. I apologize for that. Now, scientists under this conservative government are known more for being muzzled than anything else, Mr. Speaker. But let's go back to plastic. Now, as I said to start, Mr. Speaker, microbeads are small, manufactured pieces of plastic used in consumer products, as has been pointed out, like facial cleansers, shower gel, and toothpaste. Microbeads have been found in high concentrations in the Great Lakes, Mr. Speaker. And if they're found there, Mr. Speaker, in the Great Lakes, you can bet a bushel of plastic bags that they're found in the North Atlantic, in the waters off Newfoundland and Labrador, in the waters off the East Coast, in the waters off the Maritimes. Now, there's a bid by Memorial University, Mr. Speaker, the University in Newfoundland and Labrador, to study oceans, plastics, waste, and codfish consumption in Newfoundland, to see if there's a correlation between microbeads and the codfish that we consume. Let's hope that that study actually goes through, Mr. Speaker. Now, New Democrats, my party believes that the best way, Mr. Speaker, to deal with pollution is to prevent pollution in the first place. It's hard to argue with that, Mr. Speaker. Microbeads were first patented for use as cleaners in 1972, but it wasn't until the 1960s that manufacturers started using them to replace more natural materials such as almonds, oatmeal, and sea salt. Alternatives to microbeads, Mr. Speaker, they do exist. Now, because of that, they're not considered an essential ingredient in cosmetics and personal care products. Now, Mr. Speaker, if microbeads are not essential, and if they're known to cause harm to fish and other wildlife, if microbeads cause asphyxiation or blockage of organs in marine mammals, if microbeads are not essential and they're found in fish that's eaten by people, Mr. Speaker, why are we allowing microbeads, Mr. Speaker? Haven't we learned yet that we put people first? We put people first, Mr. Speaker, by putting the environment first. Haven't we learned that we put people first, Mr. Speaker, by preventing pollution in the first place? Now, Mr. Speaker, in recent years, a $171 million sewage treatment plant has been built in St. John's, in my riding, Mr. Speaker, of St. John's South Mount Pearl. But wastewater treatment plants, like the Riverhead treatment plant, again in my riding, they're not able to filter out microbeads because microbeads are too small and they're buoyant. Now, Mr. Speaker, there are hundreds of communities around Newfoundland and Labrador that don't have sewage treatment plants. Hundreds, Mr. Speaker. Upgrading the $171 million treatment plant at St. John's, Mr. Speaker, would cost tens of millions of dollars more. Now, where would that money come from, Mr. Speaker? There are no known ways to effectively remove microbeads, microplastics, after they make their way into the environment. So, Mr. Speaker, what do we want? What do New Democrats want with regards to microbeads? We want this government to take immediate action to designate microbead plastics as toxic under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. That would allow the Government of Canada to regulate, phase out, and eliminate the use of microbeads used or produced in Canada. Already, Mr. Speaker, as has been pointed out, 2 states in the United States have banned the use of microbeads in personal care products. Countries around the world are doing the same. Here at home, Mr. Speaker, a private member's bill has been introduced in Ontario, but we need federal regulation, Mr. Speaker, one law for all provinces and territories. What do New Democrats want, Mr. Speaker? We want a clean environment. We want healthy fish. We want healthy people. New Democrats want a level playing field for all businesses that manufacture products containing microbeads. Now, what do I want, Mr. Speaker, as a member of Parliament for Newfoundland and Labrador, for St. John's South Mount Pearl? Well, Mount Pearl, number one, Mr. Speaker, I'd like the fish to come back. I wish the fish came back immediately 2 years after the moratorium, like John Crosby predicted. I'd like that to happen, but it's not predicted for another 10 years. That's what I want, Mr. Speaker. But an equally important wish, Mr. Speaker, is for this government, the Conservative government, the Government of Canada, to become a better steward of the environment. Because more and more, Mr. Speaker, this Conservative government is failing the environment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Questions?